Shalom from Jerusalem. My name is Ofra Tirosh Becker, and I'm the director of the Bensm Institute for the Study of Jewish Communities in the East. It is my great pleasure to open this special webinar on studying the Middle East through the prism of the Jewish communities, co-sponsored by the Joint Distribution Committee and the Bensm Institute. As a virtual public lecture, we are drawing participants from around the world using the Zoom technology, which enables us to continue our academic and cultural activities in these trying times. I welcome our audience wherever you are. The Bensm Institute for the Study of Jewish Communities in the East, which I head, is a joint research institute of Yad Ben-Tzvi and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Founded in 1947 by Yitzhak Ben-Tzvi, Israel's second president. The Institute carries out Yitzhak Ben-Tzvi's vision through research, documentation, and dissemination of the history, culture, communal life, heritage, and legacy of the Jewish communities under Islamic rule and in other Middle Eastern and Asian countries. The Bensm Institute is initiating and supporting research on multitude aspects of these communities and their people, combining the study of documents, manuscripts, and printed material with fieldwork and interviews. The Institute also encourages and supports the publication of monographs and texts exposing the history and cultural activities of these communities. I invite you all to visit us in the charming venue of the Bensm Institute in the center of Jerusalem. We are delighted to collaborate with the Joint Distribution Committee on this event. I would like to thank the dedicated teams of both the Bensm Institute and the Joint for their effective collaborative organization of this special event, which symbolizes synergy and an inspiring cross-fertilization in research and action between our two institutions, each institution with its unique perspective on life in these Jewish communities. I thank Ms. Linda Levy, the director of JDC's Global Archives, Isabel Rohr and Abra Cohen from the Joint Headquarters in New York, Anat Kutner, who is the director of the Joint Jerusalem Archives, and Michal Ben Yaakov of Ephrata College, Hanan Harif and Efrat Even of the Bensm Institute here in Jerusalem for their endless effort for the success of this special event. Our special webinar today is held in honor of Professor Yaron Tzur of the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University. Professor Tzur is a distinguished researcher of the Jewish communities in North Africa and is the founder and academic editor of JPress, the Historical Jewish Press Project, which is a most valuable and voluminous project enabling digital access to thousands of Jewish journals. JPress has made these cultural treasures accessible to researchers, students, and the general public, and we are all thankful for this wonderful project. Toda rabba, Yaron. Let me now introduce Dr. Michal Ben Yaakov, who will talk about Professor Yaron Tzur's and the study of international Jewish organization in Islamic countries. Dr. Michal Ben Yaakov is a recent Emirata in Islamic, Emirata scholar of history at the Ephrata College of Education in Jerusalem and first director of its unique graduate program entitled Memory, Heritage, and Education. Her research focuses on Jews in 19th and 20th century North Africa and Eretz Israel, as well as the experiences of North African Jews during the two world wars, focusing on the experiences of Jewish women, particularly, but not exclusively in those communities. She has lectured widely in Israel, the United States, and Europe, published over 40 articles, and edited 4 conference volumes. Dr. Ben Yaakov, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ofra. It is a pleasure and indeed a privilege to open this public lecture in honor of Professor Yaron Tzur. Professor Yaron Tzur is unique in academia, a productive and profound historian, innovative in his work on the Jews in Islamic lands, and initiating groundbreaking projects which became institutions in themselves. His academic career began in 1977 when, as one of the founders of the Open University in Israel, he wrote its first introductory course in modern Jewish history. He then became aware of the shocking imbalance between the historiography of Jews from Islamic countries and those from Europe. This brought him to write his doctorate on the Jews of Tunisia during the transition from the independent Muslim rule to a French colonial administration in the late 19th century. With French imperialism came the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the first modern international Jewish organization. Tzur joined a small group of up-and-coming scholars from around the world, today renowned historians as Aaron Rodrigue from Stanford University, Esther Ben-Bassat at the Sorbonne, and others who uncovered the extensive documentation in the Alliance archives in Paris. Together, they created the foundation for the first systematic study of Jews in Islamic countries, each in his own area of interest. Over the last decades, Tzur has brought to light new sources for research and, most importantly, created new methodologies and concepts for research, not bound by the historiography of European Jewry. A brief look at Tzur's doctorate on the Jews of Tunisia in the 19th century sheds light on two central themes, crucial for the study of Jews in Muslim countries in modern times. First, how European colonial penetration changed Jewish society. And second, who the cultural arbitrators and agents were and how they mediated between European and non-European Jews. Tzur emphasized that the Alliance in its Western philanthropic work was not content with merely improving the material situation of local Jews, but took it upon itself to change the culture of the natives, indigenes, in colonial terminology. The Alliance's greatest ambition was to totally submerge a number of boys and girls in French civilization who would be radically different from the majority of Jews. Not only would they participate in the European economic pyramid of their country, but they could also function as mediators between the colonizer and the colonized, the European and the native, and achieve mobility in economic, political, and cultural spheres, as well as migrate to almost any country of any Western country and return as they wish. These new Westernized Jews brought about a dramatic change in the structure of the Jewish communities in North Africa and the Middle East, which had not yet undergone general processes of modernization. From this point on, Jewish society, which had been divided by traditional socioeconomic strata and at times also ethnic lines, was now divided by cultural capital as well. These divisions Tzur calls sections, migzarim, not limited to Jews, but particularly prevalent among them due to the involvement of Alliance. An additional theme, which first emerged from Tzur's doctorate and his interest in how world Jewry impacted on the local Jews, led him to scrutinize the variants of a nascent Jewish nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As Tzur and his colleague, Professor Yosef Shitrit, claim, alternative routes were also opened by the new native intellectual elite, those of a North African Haskalah and proto-nationalism, characterized by traditional yet enlightened writings and controlled by local Jews, who drew their inspiration in part from the new Hebrew newspapers and literature. Tzur identified them as maskilim. Thus, one learns from Tzur and Shitrit that Arabic-speaking Jews awakened to Jewish nationalism in their own Muslim countries. This was not Zionism, although it drew inspiration from the lovers of Zion, Chovevei Tzion, and Herzl. Today, in this context, Tzur views Zionism as an international Jewish organization, beginning at more or less the same historic moment and competing with the Alliance. while the Alliance was not actually an international Jewish body, but a branch of a Jewish minority in the French Empire at its height. The early buds of Zionism, however, were clipped. What would the Jews in Muslim countries have to gain from Hebrew? Nonetheless, this work challenges existing assumptions that Jewish nationalism was brought to Muslim lands by Ashkenazi Zionist representatives, particularly after World War II. Tzur continued to develop these themes, turning to Morocco in the 20th century. In his award-winning book, A Torn Community, The Jews of Morocco and Nationalism. In post-World War II Morocco, French imperialism was dying, nationalism was on the rise, and Zionism was transformed. At this juncture, the Joint began its far-reaching activities among the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East, providing the much-needed resources for health, education, and welfare. Once again, changing the face of Jewish society in the Middle East. In light of the titanic political changes in the region, they had only some 2 decades to do their work and ultimately assisted in the mass emigration of Jews from the region. Continually pushing the boundaries of his own work and that on Jews in Islamic countries, his most recent work, Notables and Other Jews in the Ottoman Middle East, 1750 to 1830, examines his theories of multi-layered sectional societies in the Ottoman Empire, teasing out the international networks of Jewish notables under Ottoman rule, of international merchants, and of the rabbinical elite. Not existing in an ivory tower, personal and national issues and politics influenced Tzur, who was born together with the State of Israel in 1948. Intersecting with his research on the Jews in North Africa, he developed new approaches to the Baya Adatit, the ethnic problem in Israel, relating to trends in the study of nationalism and colonialism and his own work on sectional societies. Integrating historical paradigms and his sociological studies, he has identified a form of inner colonialism existing within Jewish society. Tzur has fully embraced the digital revolution in research, a pioneer in the field now known as digital humanities. A long way from the index cards and photocopies of the 1970s, traveling to minimally cataloged archives to make handwritten notes. In 2004, he founded the Historical Jewish Press at Tel Aviv University, a project to digitize Jewish newspapers, a treasure chest for research on the history and culture of world Jewry in the modern era. First, those in North Africa, and since 2010 throughout the Jewish world in cooperation with the National Library of Israel. J-Press, as Professor Ofra Tirosh-Becker noted, now includes over 400 newspapers and some 13 languages, continually expanding and improving search options. Above all, Yaron is a true mentor. Through thoughtful questions and personal discussions, encouraging, supporting, and pushing his students and his colleagues towards more precise and comprehensive research, all with humility and modesty. To this end, in the year 2000, he initiated the Jews of Islamic Countries Archiving Project at Tel Aviv University for digitizing and cataloging primary materials for the use of students, scholars, and the general public interested in exploring the history of Jews from Islamic countries. Bolstering this project, he conducts a Scholars Forum, run by young scholars in the field to encourage the cross-fertilization of ideas with the goal of developing the next generation of scholars to the highest standards. Yaron has indeed Emid Talmidim Harbe, as written in Pirkei Avot. He has nurtured many students and helped establish them as scholars in their own right. In concluding, Professor Yaron Tzur has developed the study of Jews in Islamic countries as a field in its own rightful place in the interdisciplinary study of Jewish history, and indeed history in general, affording us not only the fruits of his research, but also the tools of his trade, and an atmosphere of camaraderie. With the spatial turn in humanities, Tzur is opening up new ways of studying international Jewish organizations with paradigms appropriate to widely varying goals and strategies, locales and times. This has recently brought him to develop a theory of shared identity, Teza HaMifgash, within the dispersed Jewish people, focusing on Mizrahi Jews and their diverse encounters with others, within a wide spectrum ranging from negative colonial influences to positive Jewish solidarity. We eagerly anticipate the publication of new works and wish Professor Yaron Tzur many more happy, productive years ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Yaakov, for your enlightening presentation of Professor Yaron Tzur's great achievements in both his studies on the history of North African history and his wonderful initiative and fulfillment of JPress. I am now delighted to present Ms. Linda Levy, who is the director of the Joint Distribution Committee's Global Archives in New York. Linda will introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Lior Sternfield. Please.
Thank you, Ofra, and thank you, Michal. Good afternoon. The JDC Archives is delighted to sponsor today's webinar together with the Bensm Institute in honor of Professor Yaron Tzur. We are thrilled that so many of you have joined us this afternoon from all over the world. Our keynote speaker today, Dr. Lior Sternfield, is an assistant professor of history and Jewish studies at Penn State University. He is a social historian of the modern Middle East with particular interest in the histories of the Jewish people and other minorities of the region. His first book, Between Iran and Zion, Jewish Histories of 20th Century Iran, examines against the backdrop of Iranian nationalism, Zionism, and constitutionalism, and the development of and integration of Jewish communities in Iran into the nation-building projects of the last century. Sternfield is currently working on a new book project, which will be the first comprehensive study of the Iranian Jewish diaspora in the US and Israel. Dr. Sternfield received the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship in 2012 to conduct research in the JDC Archives for his doctoral studies. The title of his lecture today is Studying the Middle East Through the Prism of the Jewish Communities. Our format is that the speaker will present for 40 to 45 minutes, and this will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones have been turned off and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the lecture. Dr. Sternfield, you are invited to now begin your lecture. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
All right. Just a second, we'll share. I'm still trying to get used to this Zoom format. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Linda and Ofra and the steering committee of this wonderful workshop for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. I'm honored to present this talk as I see so many scholars whose work I admire. And even one of them was my former mentor, hi, Susan Miller. So we can see how their pioneering work has paved the way to the methodological revolution in the field. I appreciate the opportunity to connect a number of ideas, raise some questions, and share it with you. Today, I want to provide an overview of what I believe are two important shifts in Middle East studies and Jewish studies of an increased curiosity regarding Middle Eastern Jewish communities among scholars of Jewish studies, and a similar development coming from scholars of the Middle East studies towards Jewish histories of the region. This confluence of different approaches which we will call the Middle Eastern in Jewish studies and the Jewish turn in Middle East studies, were accompanied by discoveries of new archives, databases, and methodologies. The field of Jewish studies in the Middle East, in the Anglo-American tradition, has been around for about a century, give or take, with the studies of the Geniza, but also studies of Orientalist anthropological nature, such as Walter Fisher's research on Persian Jews, Bukharan Jews, Afghanistan, Muhammad Kanbib and Haim Zafrani on Morocco, and more. The field was changed after 1948 to reflect the vast changes in the region and Jewish history with the establishment of Israel. The Israel-Palestine and the Israel-Arab conflicts shaped the generation of scholars of Jewish studies in the region. Scholarship now had to explain the exodus of Jews from Arab countries. Jewish communities across the region were studied in isolation from the majority society. Scholarship was written by mostly Jewish researchers who had access to Jewish languages and sources, but limited knowledge of the Middle Eastern societies in which Jews lived for millennia. That scholarship was characterized by focusing on Jewish exceptionalism, religious texts, Zionist activities, dedication to Zionism, persecution of Jews and their inherent legal inferiority, and their eventual redemption in Israel. Around the early 1980s, something happened with the emergence of a new generation of scholars, and I believe this should be a topic of another research. This generation was trained in various institutions from Israel through England and the US, specializing in myriad of areas and subjects, writing dissertations on questions of economy, religion, class, ethnicity, and ultimately published a series of path-breaking books that perhaps for the first time considered the Jewish communities first and foremost part of their respective societies. Among them, we saw Abraham Marcus on Aleppo, Gudrun Kremer and Joel Beinin on Egypt, Aaron Rodrigue on Ottoman Jews, Daniel Schroeter and Susan Miller on Morocco, and so on. They all studied different societies, as I mentioned, different periods. They used different sources, from newspapers, community archives, oral histories, state archives, cemeteries, court protocols, but the work changed the way we view the experience of the Jewish communities in the MENA region. This generation shaped the field, not just with the writing, but also in direct and indirect mentorship of the next generation of scholars. They trained the next generation of historians of the Middle East who study the Jewish communities, as opposed to scholars of Jewish studies who study Jewish communities in the Middle East. And they, in turn, reinvented the field. Historians such as Sarah Abervaya-Stein walked us through questions of class, center-periphery relations, global networks, and imperial identity. Orit Bashkin, who offered the first comprehensive account of the Iraqi Jewish community from perspectives of the roles in the Iraqi society all the way to their eventual immigration to Israel. Michel Campos, who exemplified the power of the Ottoman identity and framework towards the end of the empire, but more importantly, far from the imperial center. Julia Phillips-Cohen showed us the manifestations of Ottoman national identity among Jews and the importance of their historical consciousness in shaping the relationship with the leadership. Joshua Schreier, who complicated our understanding of the Arab Jew in the Maghreb and the influence of the local identity vis-a-vis the imposed colonial identity. And this is just to name a few. My generation stands on the shoulders of all these giants. The scholarship of the past 20 years by these 2 or 3 generations of historians has shown that adhering to national and nationalist narratives and historiographies provide us with very partial understanding at best. National historiographies overwhelmingly tell the stories of the majority society, but this is far from being complete or even representative. Let's take a look at a few examples. Iran, the subject of my research, has many historiographical traditions. We can find historiographical schools that shed light onto class, religion, economy, nationalism, social movements, but all of them from the focal point of the Persian ethnicity. Now, Iran is a country of minorities. There are about 27 minority communities, religious, ethnic, lingual. While it's true that Iran is over 90% Shia, it's just about 50% Persian. When all the historiography is written from Persian experience because of visibility, language skills, access to sources, we miss many parts of everything that happened in Iran in the past 150 years. We miss the major role non-Persian or non-Shia minorities played in the development of education, professional training, urbanization, economy, and more. Now, if we zoom out and examine the other major Middle Eastern cities, we find that many of them were in fact ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse and cosmopolitan cities. Omitting these aspects crucially harms not just our understanding of the cities, but understanding of the transformation that took place in those societies. And I'll get back to it soon. Last point regarding the development of the field. Middle East studies has profoundly changed in the past decade, especially since 2011 and the Arab Spring. Until 2011, a standard training of graduate students in Middle Eastern studies across disciplines would have included anywhere from 1 semester to 2 years of immersive language programs in Tehran, Cairo, Beirut, or Damascus. They could study the cities. Then students could get comfortable research fellowships from multiple agencies in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, or Lebanon. They could access some archives. It was never all of the archives, never unrestricted access, but they could get a sense of the country and the society they set to study. All of this, of course, did not apply to me as an Israeli student studying Iran, but it's on the sides of this field. However, in 2011, following the Arab Spring, a lot has changed. Syria descended into a bloody and terrible civil war. Lebanon was heavily impacted by it. Yemen suffered just as much. Egypt became highly unstable, and a couple of horror stories about students being arrested or disappeared pretty much made many institutions far more reluctant to send their students on programs there. The island of stability, if I may borrow the phrase from President Carter, were now Morocco, Tunisia, the Gulf Emirates, and to some extent Jordan. Iran was always risky, but visas were given with greater generosity in politically calmer times, and it became almost impossible to obtain visas in more turbulent periods. In short, many of the archives and libraries that served so many researchers for decades were now off limits. So with this new reality, students and scholars had to find alternative ways to study the Middle East. The field needed a methodological and conceptual shakeup. Thanks to the intellectual infrastructure that was laid by the historians I mentioned earlier, I believe that almost instantaneously, researchers had found that approaching the study of the societies would be possible and even beneficial from the perspective of religious minorities. The imperial and colonial order from one side, and the Ottoman legacy of religious autonomy on the other, and involvement of international religion-based organizations in minority affairs from the 18th and 19th century produced very promising archives. So while high quality research was being produced for many years prior to that, scholars with little to no interest in religious minorities found how revealing this perspective can be. The change could be seen in the annual meetings of the AJS and MESA. In both conferences every year, more and more panels dealt with Jewish histories of the region. There are political motivations as well, of course, such as the attempt to intervene in major issues, such as the questions of Jewish refugees or immigrants, questions about the role of Zionism in the Middle East before and after 1948, and more. And we can get to it later, but the change was imminent. Collaborative projects have started to gather works from many disciplines and perspectives towards new understanding of the region and the religious minorities. I'll mention two of them here, and I'm happy to talk about it more in details in the Q&A. One of them is the Ben Gurion University Forum for the Study of Jews and Christians in the Middle East, and another is a collaborative work that is now in very early stages that is run in collaboration between Penn State, Ben-Gurion University, and the University of Chicago. Another transformation can be seen in the University Press's list of Middle Eastern studies. Publishers such as Princeton, Stanford University Press, Oxford, and others added myriad of phenomenal titles dealing with the topics that previously would have gone straight to the Jewish studies list and are now presented in the Middle East section. I want to bring our conversation about historiography into dialogue with the historical archive. Without getting too much into the historian's craft, I will try to illuminate several archives and resources that not only help us conduct research, but also improve our scholarship, whether we study Jewish communities or not. Since this session is in honor of Yaron Tzur, I shall begin with his brainchild, the Historical Jewish Press Database. This website has become such an important tool that I feel it needs no introduction, but I will introduce it anyway. I'll build on what Michal said in the introduction, that it started in 2005, 2010 as digitization project of Jewish newspapers. Today, it holds hundreds of titles and hundreds of thousands of pages from newspapers from 19th and 20th century throughout the Jewish world. The interface is user-friendly, and the keywords and search options are geared toward professional and non-professional audiences. While we can't visit 19th century or early 20th century Cairo, Istanbul, Algiers, or Iran, we can visit their newspapers and get a feeling of the public sphere. Ottoman and Turkish archives are relatively accessible, but a visitor to this website can trace the origins of Ottoman nationalism and late imperial identity. We can learn about trends of the Ottoman networks in the Americas, discourses on government reforms, but more than that, it helps us map the cities differently. For example, in the pages of Ladino newspapers from Istanbul, we can analyze the vision of the Jewish minority for their future in the Ottoman Empire in the transitional period of early 20th century. How did they envision the possibilities that the new governmental reforms presented to them? By examining the response of the minorities, we can assess the role that the leadership of the empire assigned to them. Between Michel Campos and Julia Phillips Cohen's scholarship, for example, we get a very textured understanding of what powers the imperial identity had across urban centers in the empire in a period that otherwise is considered to be all but vibrant in terms of political life. I'm grateful to my friend and colleague Murat Yildiz for pointing out to me the subtle discursive differences found among Ottoman Muslim majority and Ottoman Jewish minority communities in the imperial center. While Muslim majority conversation often revolved around the need to reform, discussion on the relative inferiority of the empire vis-a-vis European superpowers, the Jewish press and discourse celebrated Ottoman might, diversity, heritage. My argument here is that looking exclusively at one corpus inevitably provides an imperfect representation. For discussions in the late Ottoman Empire's multilinguistic press was not just about the need to reform or alternatively believe in Ottoman exceptionalism. It was both in varied levels. To help us think more concretely about the press, I want to turn to advertisement. What can we learn from advertisement in these newspapers? We can see what parts were more segregated in the city than others. Seeing ads for restaurants that were kosher or not, but catered for Jews, help us drawing the lines of presence in different parts of the city. Ads for sailing companies, allow us to look into trends of Ottoman migration, Ottoman networks and commerce, and then connect it with the Ladino press of Ottoman expats in the Americas. It can lead into economic development and building of wealth and opportunities in the empire and on behalf of the empire. Were there similar ads in Istanbul's multilinguistic press? Were there different ads for Ladino, Armenian, Greek, and Ottoman Turkish newspapers? What's the significance of this? While I was preparing for this talk, I combed through the pages of a number of Ladino newspapers from Istanbul. In January 1904, I noticed many ads for insurance companies. It made me wonder, what happened in Istanbul that month or short time earlier? Was it something in the city, in the region? Was it relevant specifically for Jews? This is, by the way, the emphasis that we have to put in training our students. Don't use the convenient shortcuts that digital resources give you. There is no substitute to combing through the boxes and pages to understand and put events and information in context. There is plenty more to say about titles in J-Press from North Africa, Egypt, and the rest of the Middle East, and how we can see the emergence of modern urban middle class through their pages, but I leave it for another time. I will say, though, that there are no titles from Iran, and I hope that this will change after this talk. Another crucial archive is the one of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. The archive is in Paris, and a trip to Paris can take the reader to see cities differently. From Hamadan in Iran to Fez in Morocco, Alliance schools started to appear in the second half of the 19th century and provide us with unique perspective on Middle Eastern societies, including horizontal differences, developments from the Maghreb to Iran. The story of the Alliance is very different, not just from country to country, but even from city to city in the same country. The nature of every society is pronounced in the goals of each school. Its connections with France and French culture and the Jewish world. In many communities, the Alliance schools became the pillar of the community, with implication greater than the education they provided. The regional perspective is invaluable. In Iran, for example, until later in the 1920s, Alliance and missionary schools were almost the only alternative in most towns and cities to the traditional kitab khaneh and religious schools. In this context, I would like to call attention to the history of missionary schools that had similar social functions, and also institutions such as the American University of Beirut and the American University of Cairo. The opening of Alliance schools in Iran in 1898 assigned these institutions role larger than they had thought. In Tehran, Isfahan, Hamadan, Burjard, Shiraz, Kermanshah, Yazd, and other Iranian cities, the Alliance helped to feed graduates into the growing bureaucracy and public service. The unique training that included languages, basic science, and humanities was beneficial in communicating in French and British companies that had received concessions for national projects, as well as for commerce and trade in the region and beyond, to India, East Asia, and Europe in the West. The first few cohorts of graduates were able to become part of new emerging urban middle class and the nationalist bourgeoisie. Among them, we can find representatives to the Majlis, such as Shmuel Chaim, high-profile professionals and leaders of the Jewish communities and Zionist organizations. This early success prompted Alliance to open more schools across Iran. This success also increasingly helped identify Alliance not only as a Jewish school, but more importantly, as a vehicle for upward social mobility. As such, more and more Muslim, Christian, Baha'i students looked for placement with the Alliance schools in Iran. Given that it happened largely before the public education system was in place, it started in 1907, but was centralized only in the 1920s and rolled out throughout the 1930s, we can read through the Alliance history, how it helped to shape Iranian education. We can see also how the dynamics between superpowers and Western representatives in Iran and their long-lasting legacy in the country. And I want to show you a few photos. This is, for example, Reza Shah visiting the Alliance School in Hamadan in 1936. This is the Alliance School in Isfahan, in Tehran. So interestingly, the documents from the Alliance archives tell us about the many directions Alliance schools drifted in different places under different circumstances, and how this essentially secular establishment talked about the need to create a rabbinical school in Iran and the need to create religious leadership among Persian Jewry. In the letter from Shiraz, dated to August 1910, the Alliance official in the city, he talked about the voluntary conversion of Jews to Islam for many reasons. Quote, when pestered by his creditor, a woman who is unhappy with her husband and cannot procure a divorce, a son who is tired of submitting to his father's authority, or a young woman who has had enough of her parents' supervision, is to go to the mujtahid and ask to be accepted into the Islamic religion, end quote. To assist assimilation, Alliance schools focused on teaching High Persian and to rid the Iranian Jews of their terrible jargon of Judeo-Persian, of course, the Jewish dialect. There were other reports too, expressing different and opposing sentiments, talking about the need to rescue the local Jews from the religious tradition that keep them from becoming part of the society. In many ways, it reflects the situation of the Iranian society at the midst of the constitutional revolution and its aftermath. So the attempt to place the role of religion as good or bad, as needed or an obstruction, were all part of the Iranian national discourse after 1911. There are other Jewish educational institutions that were more or less influential, such as Otzar Torah or Ort or Etefak, but I will not get to them now, and I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. From the Alliance correspondence in Cairo and Alexandria, we can see the formation of the Francophone urban elites. We can see how language had become a signifier of social class and a factor in advancement and upward mobility. In this case too, Alliance archive give us many points of view to analyze the interconnection of French and North African culture, the perception of self-identity that is unique, and the result of a century of colonial and imperial relationships. And the creation of political and philosophical thinkers and leaders, such as Albert Memmi, for example, who attended the Alliance School in Tunisia in the 1920s. I would also ask, is the Alliance Israelite Universelle Archive necessarily a Jewish archive? Or is it also an archive of the local societies? Who's using this archive? I will say that it is possible to write the history of the Egyptian middle class, for example, without consulting the Alliance Israelite Universelle Archive. But I think that combining the AIU with other sources and institutions provide a much richer understanding of the Egyptian society. I had only minimal work with the Alliance archive because of the focus and the scope of my work. But scholars of Iranian Jewry have used it for many years, and there are new works being written while using fresh look at these documents. One of them is Daniela Farah from Stanford University. So there's a lot to look forward to with regards to this archive. The last resource that I want to discuss today is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee archive. I spent the longest time working with materials from there. The JDC archive is located in New York and Jerusalem. This organization provides us phenomenal view on the developments of every Middle Eastern society since the 1940s. The JDC operated in so many fields and sometimes carried semi-diplomatic missions: education, healthcare, religious matters, community organization, women's rights, and more. Every development in those areas that had to follow the state rules, and regulation can be traced in the documents of the JDC. And it's not just the depth of materials in those fields, it is also the breadth. We get reports from almost every corner of the Middle East. From the major cities in Morocco to smaller villages in the Atlas Mountains, cities, towns, and villages in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and more. I would say that our ability to understand what happened in the Middle East during World War II is limited without using the JDC archives. Being an American organization with global reach gives us the option to see simultaneously how events rolled out. Let's take, for example, the story of the Tehran Children. This is the story of Polish Jewish orphans who were deported by the Soviet Union in 1939 to Siberia and Central Asia, and then were transferred to Iran en route to Palestine. For many years, the story and our body of knowledge was limited to the story of these 750 children, pretty much detached from context. There was little literature. There was the literature based on British sources, oral histories, some Soviet and Polish sources. There were fewer Iranian sources on the story, but there were more materials to work with regarding the wave of Polish refugees who arrived at Iran at the same time, which the initial narrative of the Tehran Children completely missed. The JDC and other aid organizations such as the Red Cross can tell us a lot about what happened in Iran and then Iraq and Palestine, and connect the story of these children to the greater story of World War II in the region. From the archives of the JDC, we can trace the origins of this wave, the deportation, the period in the Soviet camps, and then the journey to Palestine through Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq. We can see many more reports on the condition of the Polish refugees in Iran, the way that they were received in Iran, the numbers. Scholars such as Atina Grossman have used this archive to connect it to a previous period of arrival of German expats in Iran, and the way that they saw the social and political turmoil in the country in the transition from Reza Shah to the Allied Army's occupation and the beginning of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi period. Michal Dekel also just recently published a highly acclaimed book on this story that is based in part on this archive. There are very few Iranian sources that are publicly available to talk about the impact of such wave on the Iranian society. How did it affect the culture, the economy? What did the refugee camp appear when and how they functioned? We know a lot more about Iran during World War II because of the Jewish archives. We can also see, when I wrote the article on Polish Tehran, I used many sources from the JDC archive, and we came to discover all those districts that were very busy with Polish refugees. So we had hotels and orchestras and bars that catered predominantly to the Polish refugees, but then also to the service soldiers in Tehran, to the Iranian new middle class. And also we find all kinds of anecdotes from the Jewish communities. For example, I found a letter that were very resentful on the fact that Jewish Polish girls went to work as waitresses in bars and coffee shops in Tehran, and how it puts the community to shame. So from the reports of the JDC, we can learn a lot about the political sphere in that period as well. We know that the Tudeh party was a very popular movement in Iran, but how popular was it? If we compare it to other dominant ideological movements, we can start to understand the magnitude of it. In one report, Habib Levy, a Zionist and one of the leaders of the Jewish organization in Iran, he writes that, quote, "The young Jewish students overwhelmingly tend to support the Tudeh party when there is a void of worthy Jewish organizations," end quote. So we can see, when facing two profoundly different ideological choices, the Iranian Jews chose one, the Iranian Tudeh, over the other, Jewish Zionists. Of the other issues in Iran, we discover through the Jewish archives, we see the issue of many Iraqi citizens living in Iran. The JDC petitioned on behalf of Iraqi Jews living in Iran to get Iranian citizenship. We learn of the state push to open vocational training institutions, nursing schools. We also learn about the massive immigration to the cities and the impact of the layout and the impact on the layout of the city. Anecdotally, we can see that some rural non-Jewish Iranians try to get immigration visas to Israel because they heard that it might be better for them and forged Jewish genealogies. So we can say something about tendencies for immigration, perhaps. But the JDC is useful to study in other countries as well. Esther Meir, for example, wrote a highly polemic book on the immigration operation of Yemenite Jews. Her book was heavily informed by documents from the JDC archives and tells us, apart from the story of organizing this operation, the complicated relationship between the local and state powers, between them and colonial powers, regional conflicts, and more. Lastly, although this talk is about studying the Middle East through prism of Jewish community, with emphasis on the Muslim societies, I'll say that the field of Middle East studies cannot be complete without adding Israel to the analytic framework of the region. When coming to Israel, the JDC is indispensable. Absorbing immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, being mediator between Israel and other governments, providing interesting, albeit infuriating at times, reports on the status of Israelis, the Israeli society, the transition camps, and the economy. These are all sources that we must use more extensively in the study of the Middle East. I'll end this talk with yet another example of the insights we get from the JDC when we look at the reports from two different ends of one event. Stanley Abramowitz, one of the JDC directors, wrote a report in 1951 from Iran, where he described one instance of Jews from Nehevand. I quote, "The letters that come from Israel dampen all spirits. The Iranian Jew is not the Chalutzik, pioneer type. The ordeals of present-day life in Israel have left him discouraged, longing to return to his damp, dark ghetto room, for he has been used to that room and even liked it. Food is available in Iran. Although he earned little, he lived in an environment which was not strange to him. The language, the people, the life was familiar. Israel is not. As a Persian, he is looked down upon. The letters that come back to Iran complain about shortage of food. Nehevand received a letter and a Torah scroll from their brethren in Israel. The Nehevand Jews in Israel signed their names on this piece of scroll, and in the accompanying letter they wrote that they took an oath by the Torah from which they sent a piece that their brethren in Israel and in Nehevand will not come to Israel now. Anyway, not until they inform them that the time is more suitable. And Nehevand is a godforsaken place in the mountains of Luristan, cut off from the outside world. Yet the Lenchlight in Israel advised them, adjured them to remain in Nehevand. Another family was advised not to leave for Israel until the son Joseph is married. Joseph is 1 year old. By way of conclusion, I'd like to raise a few questions. This is part of an ongoing conversation and early stages of a different project, but what is the role of these archives, digital and physical, in the age of COVID? How do we, students and faculty, continue to produce research when globally travel is restricted? Is it going to impact our field, the discipline of history, anthropology, area studies? It is interesting to think about the space of the archives in our work, not just the boxes, but the added value of conversations with the archivist, the smell of the archive, the experience of traveling to places, be it Jerusalem, Paris, Cairo, New York, or Istanbul, an experience that is very different while working with digitized collections. I'll stop here and open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
We're now going to entertain questions. I see we have a bunch of them in line already. Lior, here's a question from Zachary Baker. In the field of Middle Eastern studies, is there much current comparative scholarship on religious and ethnic minorities within specific cities and countries and throughout the region? E.g., Jews, Greeks, and Armenians in Ottoman Turkey, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians in Iran, etc.
So this is part of the trend that I mentioned in my talk. We see now more of these comparative studies, not so much in the field of Iranian studies, unfortunately, not yet. But we see, for example, on Alexandria, on Cairo, the Ottoman Empire, broadly in Anatolia, Turkey. So yeah, there are more studies that take the perspective of religious minorities to be the basis of comparative studies.
This is a question from Mark Bernstein. Would Professor Sternfield be willing to address the ways in which the use of resources allows researchers to present a more nuanced view of the absorption of Middle Eastern Jews into Israeli society, aside from the narrative of redemption and negation of diaspora life?
Yeah, so, go ahead.
There's another part here, terminology. Why in Israel has the term Mizrahim not evolved into a more accurate descriptor? Arab Jews works, but of course excludes the non-Arabic speaking communities.
So this is a great question. I feel like critical Israel studies is something that we begin to see now. And to understand the first years after 1948 with the absorption of immigrants from all over the world, but especially if we talk about the Middle Eastern Jews, every archive, especially the state archives that are extremely useful and I must say relatively easy to work with, they provide very certain perspective. Because the people who wrote the reports held certain, I'll try to, to be, they held certain worldview and they were on mission and they didn't try to look or to walk in someone else's shoe for that matter. So to understand, for example, the transition camp experience, if we look only on the state archives, we see the mechanical details of it. We don't see, there's no room for a feeling of the different groups in the transition camps. We don't see resentment unless it came to the top, to the management of the camp. We don't see alliances between different groups. If we look on the JDC records, and I had, again, this is something that I just started working on, so I can't talk a lot about it, but the JDC perspectives give us different, different point of view. So we see more emphasis on movement in the camps. We see how we can connect between, for example, the Iranian Jewish community in the transition camp and the Iranian Jewish community in Iran, based on the JDC perspective from both sides. And the same can be traced to Morocco, to Egypt as well. And as for the category, there are many books that were written and are being written and will be written on the Mizrahi category. You asked about the Arab Jews, which is considered to be very polemic category. Yuda Shanav proposed it, I think, almost 20 years ago, and it's still, because of the charge of the term and the Israel-Arab conflict, and people from the Arab countries wanted to distance themselves from the Arab identity. Again, for many reasons. It had become much harder to use it as a useful analytical category at the time, or identity.
We have an anonymous question. Do you consider novels and historical fiction valid sources of information about Jews in Arab lands? Can you give us some examples?
So, this is a very good question, and I use memoirs and literature works in my work, but I frame them as memoirs and works of literature. We can learn a lot about the mindset in communities, in subgroups of each community. We can learn a lot about collective memory of these communities from literature and memoirs, but they are not substituting archival sources. And for me as a historian, they inform me, they let me get a glimpse into the life and culture and language of community, but it's not instead of archival sources.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. This is a question from Christopher Silver. What do you see as the limits of institutional archives? Or how do you balance institutional archives with family archives?
There are limits for institutional archives, and the limits are the goal of the institutions, the personalities that represented or they wrote the reports on behalf of the institution, and their biases and worldview and values that usually we can see come through the documents, and how they evaluate what they see based on their experiences in the country and in life. We always have to engage with these documents in critical manner. Never take it at face value. We should learn about the atmosphere and take the facts or the interpretation of the facts and try to position them against other sources, newspapers, family archives. And the same goes to family archives. Obviously, they represent very narrow understanding of history from the perspective of one family. And the family always has this mission of preserving the good reputation of the family. So we can use it. It's not making it useless. We should just make sure to juxtapose it against other sources.
This is a question from Uri Sharf. How do you see AIU's responsibility in establishing a negative stereotypical image of the Jews and the communities they worked in, i.e. Morocco, Iran, etc., based on the pejorative descriptions in their bulletins?
This is a very good question, but I'll say that from my perspective, the bulletin was not meant for the local society. And the local society did not read the bulletin, mostly. The perception of the Alliance, of the AIU schools in Iran, was that this is a great vehicle for upward social mobility. They didn't care. I don't think that, I mean, in the documents that I've read, they didn't care much about what the administration of the Alliance thought about them. They cared that they are providing them excellent training, education that would lead them to better places in the Iranian society after they graduate.
What is the place of living persons in your research?
So in my research, when I interviewed about 30, 40 people for my research, especially for chronologically, the most recent parts of my book. Oral history is almost a discipline in and of itself. And I think that it's extremely useful to interview and record those interviews and record testimonies and eyewitness accounts. But again, never to take anything uncritically. To use it, to respect the source, to deal with it gently, but to apply all those filters and lens that we know as historians of memory, bias, personal motivations in sharing stories, and so on.
Fantastic talk. This is from an anonymous attendee. You were recently interviewed by Haaretz about your work, an article that was published in both English and Hebrew. I noticed you received a lot of backlash and support in the Hebrew article. Can you talk a bit about that backlash and why you think it is so prevalent?
Yeah, so it took a week of my life to deal with all the comments. I think that I got so much backlash because it's a very sensitive topic. And also the framing of the article was very provocative on behalf of Haaretz. I mean, they wanted to get traffic and they got it. I think that talking about Jewish involvement in the revolution is and will be for many years a very sensitive topic because of the relations between Iran and Israel, because of the way that the Iranian Jewish diaspora was shaped in the US and Israel, by the way, in two very different ways. The collective memory was rewritten and was trying to be placed in one box of collective memory that does not, and cannot represent the experience of 100,000 Jews that lived in Iran during the revolution. And also in the public discourse, we find it much more problematic to deal with individual memory versus collective memory. And and this is the way that it was interpreted by many readers. If I say that Jews supported the revolution, it is immediately implied that they supported Khomeini, that they wanted the Islamic Republic, or that they did it out of fear. The first two completely ignore the political context and the historical context of the revolution. The revolution was not for Khomeini or for Islamic government. It was for an Iranian republic. And if I say that Jews were excited or working for the Iranian republic, they had no way of knowing that at the end of the day, it will be an Islamic republic. So again, it requires a lot of attention and patience to sit and read through the narratives and also understand that there is no, historical narratives are not one size fits all. We have to be careful and nuanced and give historical agency to the voices that come from Iran at the same time.
Thank you. I think we're going to take one more question. Are there studies of the relations between different Jewish communities from Islamic countries?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Are there studies of the relations between different Jewish communities from Islamic countries?
You mean transnational relations?
Yes, yes.
This is, I think that we are now, I don't know that there are, I can't recall one recent book that deals with transnational Jewish relations between different communities, but this is exactly the benefit of working with the Jewish archives, because they are everywhere and they can connect us to simultaneous accounts across the region.
I think I will take one more question, and that's, do the JDC archives also indicate networks of communication between MENA Jewish communities, between those in the transition camps, development towns, and those in other countries?
So yes, the JDC archive provides us this kind of view. As the letter that I quoted at the end of my talk is one example. Because the communication was not direct between Israel and the Arab countries or Iran, and went through New York or Geneva, it was easier to put them in conversation. And this is something that, again, the transnational nature of these institutions is a huge benefit for us to see this kind of conversation.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sternfield, and I hope the audience out there has enjoyed our program today. I'd like to thank Dr. Ofra Tirosh-Becker and the Bensm Institute for co-sponsoring this webinar. It has been a pleasure partnering with you on this program. The next JDC Archives webinar will take place on September 30th. Abra Cohen, an archivist on the JDC Archive staff, will present If Objects Could Talk, drawing from the rich holdings of the JDC artifacts and ephemera collection. Abra will analyze a range of objects which shed light on the impact of JDC assistance and the experience of JDC aid recipients over the past century. You can register for this program via our JDC Archives Facebook page. We hope that many of you will be able to join us. Thank you very much.